Hi everyone, welcome back. In this class we're going to be looking at question 2 from the grade 6 theory ABRSM syllabus, and this question focuses heavily on figured bass. So we first need to know what is figured bass, where do we find it, and how do we actually use it for the question. So I suppose we should have a look to see what is figured bass and where does it come from. I'm just going to share my desktop again. So the first little handout I just want to go through, I suppose, is an example of figured bass. What does it look like and what it was used for? In a lot of Baroque music, probably most Baroque music, you're going to come across this term of basso continuo. And the basso continuo was a continuous instrumental bass line, and it had a very important role in Baroque music, basically to thicken up the texture to provide harmony. And it was usually played by a harpsichord or an organ or some type of keyboard instrument or chordal instrument. Even a lute could do it as well. And what they would do is they would improvise chords over a given bass line. And the chords that the player will perform are indicated by figures underneath that bass line, hence the term figured bass. So those figures will actually tell you exactly which intervals to play above that bass line, but you can have a bit of freedom in determining, well, where does that particular note want to be played on your instrument. So the bass line of the harpsichord was usually doubled by the cello. So even though it looks like there's only one instrumental part, it's actually two instruments that usually play it. So for this basso continuo part here, that would be played by maybe a cello and harpsichord or lute or organ, something like that. And you can see the figures underneath, all these numbers. And underneath that, you can actually see an example of what that may look like when it's fully realized by the keyboard player. So the cello player will still play, obviously, the bass notes, but the harpsichord will play those bass notes plus these notes above. But it doesn't have to be exactly as you see here. For example, that very first chord here in that little box, the figures, there aren't any figures underneath that for a good reason. We'll get into why in a minute, but the absence of the figure bass there will suggest that it's actually a root position chord. So if that's a root position chord for this first chord, it's telling us to play a third and a fifth above that bass note. So the third above that G would be a B, and the fifth above that G is a D. So you can play the B anywhere within reason as long as it leads to good voice leading, and you can play the D anywhere within reason as long as it leads to good voice leading. So it doesn't have to be that exact B or these exact Ds. You can have a little bit of freedom to improvise a little bit when it comes to figured bass. So that means that in Baroque music there is this element a lot of the time of almost like an improvisation, depending on the performer and what they've prepared for the performance in advance and how they like to realize the figured bass. But this is just an example in red of what could be performed. So we're going to have to look then at, well, what do these figures mean? Thankfully, you don't have to know all of them. There are quite a few. I'm going to show you as well a figured bass from a trio sonata by Corelli, and you can actually see there's quite a lot of figures in the bass here. There's even ninths suggesting suspensions. You doing grade 6 though, you don't have to know all the figures that exist for figured bass, but you would need to know the three big ones for grade 6 for root position chords, first inversion chords, and second inversion chords. So you don't have to know the sevenths until maybe you get to grade 7 or grade 8. You will have to know the sevenths, but for seventh chords. But for grade 6, there's only a few that you need to know. So this is what it looks like in practice. So what are the figures that you need to know for figured bass? Okay. So on the screen, as you can see, there are 3 examples of 3 different types of figured bass that you need to know. The root position chords, so like a triad maybe, with a G, B, D. In the key of C major, this would be a chord 5. In grade 5, that might have been analysed as say 5 with the letter A after it, indicating root position chords. If you've done grade 5 ABRSM, you may be already familiar with the A, B, C way of analysing chords for root position, first inversion and second inversion. But once you get into the higher grades for grade 6, 7 and 8, you need to know the figured bass equivalents for each one of those. So any chord that's in root position is saying that above the lowest note there should be a third and a fifth harmonized somewhere above that note. And in the figured bass part, that's indicated by 5, 3. However, because those chords are so common, we actually abbreviate that to nothing at all. So if you see a bass note in a Baroque piece with a basso continuo line and there aren't any figures at all written underneath that bass note, then it's probably going to be a root position chord. So they're so common, you actually abbreviate them to nothing. First inversion chord, the next one, we've actually got the same chord, a GBD chord. So in the key of C major, this would be chord 5. But for first inversion, you can see that we're harmonizing a third and a sixth above that bass note, above that lowest note. So it's still a GBD chord, but B is now our lowest note. And of course then the figured bass is obviously 6-3 for those types of chords, but to write them in shorthand or to abbreviate that, you just write the number 6. You can actually see that in some of the examples we were looking at earlier. So for example, here you can see the number 6 underneath those bass notes. So those would be first inversion chords. And in fact, if we zoom in a little bit, just so we can actually see that a little bit clearer. Now here we're in the key of G minor, and this is going to be F sharp in the bass, and the 6 indicates a third and a sixth above that bass note. So the third above that F sharp is an A, and the sixth above that F sharp is a D. So it's a D major chord then, a chord 5, first inversion. And you can see the chord that came before it was our tonic chord, our G minor chord, and there's nothing written there at all. So that means that's going to be a root position chord. So a third and a fifth above that bass note. A third above G is the B flat because it's affected by the key signature. And a fifth above that G is the D. And it's been doubled as well, that D. Okay, so yeah, it doesn't really matter what key you're in or if it's a major key or a minor key, the figured bass is always going to be the same for root position or first inversion chords or whatever. And the last one, the second inversion, well, this chord is actually quite rare in comparison to the other types of chords, but you will come across them in your exercises and in the exam. You'd be very lucky not to come across them. It's still a GBD chord, still chord 5. The D is now our lowest note, and we have the G and the B above it. So that indicates then in your figured bass that the fourth above D will get us the G, and the sixth above that D will get us the B. So yeah, it's a second inversion chord, D as the lowest note in this example. So another way to think of it is that for first or root position, the root is the lowest note. For first inversion, the third of the chord is the lowest note, and for second inversion, the fifth of the chord is the lowest note. And the figured bass for each one of them will obviously have to be different because the intervals or the spaces between those notes will be different each time. So for second inversion chords, it's obviously then going to be 6-4 in your figured bass, and you must always write that out in full. You can't abbreviate that or summarize it down any further because 6 is already taken for first inversion and nothing is taken for root position. So for second inversion chords, you must always write them out in full as 6-4. So let's have a look then at the question for grade 6 to see how can we put some of this information into practice as well. Okay, so here's an example you may get for grade 6 theory. This is actually the very first exercise for question 2 out of the grade 6 book, grade 6 ABRSM. So you can see there's quite a few indications in the figured bass. There's a continuation line, which we'll get to in a minute. What does that mean? And there's actually a few places where there's nothing written under the bass note, implying root position chords. So how do we go about answering this question? Well, for me, there's a sort of a 7-point plan to this, but the main thing you've got to watch out for, the thing that students hate about this question, and the thing that they'll always run into when they're trying this for the first time, are parallel or consecutive fifths and octaves, perfect fifths and perfect octaves. Just like for question 1, you've got to avoid that for your harmonizing of a melody. For realizing figured bass for question 2, you've also got to avoid parallel fifths and octaves between any voice parts. Okay, so for example, if we were to harmonize this chord, say this is a B D F chord, which it actually is B flat D and F, and I was to double that B flat here, and the next chord, there's no figured bass underneath it, it's then a root position C major chord, and I was to double that C, that's actually going to create perfect octaves between your bass voice and your soprano voice. So you've got B flat in the bass and B flat in the soprano, and you've also got C in the bass and C in the soprano. So you can't do that. You can't do that for octaves between any voice part, and you can't do that for fifths between any voice part. So that's one of the things to watch out for when we're doing this. However, having said all that, if you tend to follow these guidelines, you probably will avoid parallel fifths and octaves most of the time. I would still recommend that you check as you go, as you're doing the exercise. Just keep an eye out for fifths and octaves, because you will need to revoice those chords to make it to avoid fifths and octaves. So the very first thing we need to do is establish what key we're in. So in this example, we're in the key of F major. Obviously the key signature will help out there, but also look at the music. Make sure there are no raised notes. So we don't see any raised notes in this figured bass. For example, if it was D minor, it might have C sharps. That will also be indicated in the figured bass as well. You might see sharps appearing in your figured bass. So keep an eye out for that as well. That might indicate that you're in a minor key. Yeah, so here's an example of what accidentals may look like, depending of course on the key that you're in. So remember that the numbers in your figured bass refer only to the diatonic intervals above the bass note in accordance with the key signature. So if you're in a minor key, you're probably going to have raised sevenths somewhere in the music. That has to be indicated in the figured bass because it's actually not part of the key signature. So in a key signature with 2 flats, for example, you could have 6/3 as a figured bass written underneath your bass note, which implies obviously a third and a sixth above that bass note, which would be a B flat and an E flat. And we've actually doubled the B flat in the soprano part there. So you end up with a B flat and an E flat for a 6/3 above that G. But say you wanted to have an E natural for whatever reason, maybe, I don't know, modulating or something, then you've got to indicate that in your figured bass as well. So the sixth above the G is an E flat. And if you want that to be an E natural, you have to put in a little natural sign next to that number in the figured bass, because the key signature will always keep it flat until you tell the performer otherwise. So the raised sixth above that G is now E natural. And again, here's another example. Say that we're in the same key signature, suppose B flat and E flat, and you see 6/4 written under a C in the bass. That indicates an A above the bass note. Okay, and an F. So the F would be a fourth above the bass, and the A would be a sixth above the bass. But if you wanted to have an F sharp to indicate, for example, you're in the key of G minor or something, you'd have to indicate that that fourth needs to be raised. And again, you can see that without having it, you end up with F natural. And as soon as you put that sharp in, you're making that F an F sharp. Okay, so that would be sort of the figured bass then for that particular chord, if you wanted a raised note. So you're probably going to come across accidentals quite frequently in minor keys for those raised sevenths in the harmony. So that could be another indication of a minor tonality. So just keep an eye out, quickly scan the figured bass to see are there any accidentals, and the likelihood is that that's going to be indicating your raised seventh in whatever key you happen to be in. But in the example we're looking at here, there are no raised notes. There are no sharps or anything at all in the bass, figured bass part. And of course, the music itself, the bass line that you'll be given, is obviously in the key of F major. It's quite scalic in the key of F. It starts on an F, finishes on an F, and everything is within, the span of that F. So everything's kind of in an octave and ascending and descending scalically the whole way through this exercise. So we're definitely in F major. Then the second thing you need to look out for then are your root position chords. So anywhere you don't see a figured bass indication, anywhere you don't see 5-3, indicates a root position chord, I suppose. So that F would be a root position chord. This B flat would be a root position chord. The C would be a root position chord, and the very last F will also be a root position chord. Sometimes you'll actually see 5-3 written out if it comes after a 6-4 chord, which means, or it suggests, that the sixth above this bass note is going to progress to the fifth above this bass note. Okay, so the sixth will go to the fifth, and also the fourth should move to the third. So the fourth above C will move to the third above C. That's quite a common chord progression, actually, sort of the cadential 6-4 you'll see quite often at cadences, funnily enough. Sometimes the 5-3 will be written if it comes after a 6-4 chord, indicating very specific movement in those parts. But most of the time you won't see 5-3 written, in which case any note without figured bass underneath it, treated as a root position chord. Also, you'll see that there's quite a few first inversion chords. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 first inversion chords here. And all of those also will imply the third and the sixth above those bass notes. So keep an eye out for them too. And of course, the 6-4 chord occurs twice. So yeah, that's your second inversion chord. So the fourth and the sixth above those bass notes needs to be included. Okay, so those are the three main figured basses that you need to know. Some of the guidelines when it comes to voice leading. Some of these rules can be broken sometimes depending on the context, but in general, these are the very general rules to keep in mind as you go through. Because we're dealing with four voices here, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and all the harmony is triadic. All the harmony only has 3 notes. That means that for each of these chords, there is going to be a voice part which is going to double another voice part. So you have to double one of those notes in each of the triads. Which one do you double? The root of every chord that's in root position or first inversion. That's always a good one to double. That's your best bet. If for whatever reason you don't wish to do that, if you can't do it, if it leads to bad voice leading or whatever, doubling the fifth is okay, and in fact it's very highly recommended for second inversion chords. So the fifth of those triads should be doubled. And if you remember from the previous handouts you were looking at, 6-4 implies a second inversion chord, which means the fifth is your bass note. So you're actually going to be doubling that bass note somewhere in the tenor or maybe the alto or the soprano line or something. It's quite common to have it doubled in the tenor line, if you can do that. The one that you shouldn't double is the third, especially for, I would say, your primary triads, like your chord 1, 4, and 5. You shouldn't need to double the third of those chords. There are some exceptions to this, maybe depending on the particular chord progression. For certain chords, like the leading note chord 7, doubling the third is actually quite good. And for some of your secondary chords like chord 2 or chord 6, yeah, you can double the third. So for some things like diminished chords or maybe even chord 1 sometimes, depending on particular chord progressions, you may get away with doubling the third. Okay, so point number 5 deals with sort of general guidelines for voice leading. So does number 6. This is more to do with the motion of particular voices. The tenor and the alto line, or your inner voices, tend to move they tend to progress quite smoothly. They tend to have smooth melodic motion. The tenor line especially, try to make it as static as possible so it doesn't move much at all. And if it does move, then it moves by the smallest distance possible between one chord and the next chord. So keep your inner voices smooth. You shouldn't see any wide or huge leaps in the tenor voice or in the alto voice, jumping up all over the staff. Try to keep it nice and, monotonous, I suppose. Number 7, no more than an octave between your soprano and alto parts and between your alto and tenor parts. That's just a general rule of thumb when it comes to harmonizing for 4 voices. If you're a piano player, you might be able to play a lot of these harmonizations by using your left hand for the bass voice and your right hand for all the other voices, your tenor, your alto, and your soprano. So it may look and feel weird that you've got one voice, the bass, way out on its own, and the other 3 voices are quite close together, but that is normal practice. So it's quite common actually to have more than an octave between your bass and your tenor voices. Okay, so let's have a go at completing this, see how we get on. I tend to start at the end and work my way back. That may look and sound a wee bit unusual. A lot of students will probably begin right at the start and work their way from the top down. That's the worst way I think of doing it. It's the absolute worst way of doing it, because you end up running into problems because you can't actually see where the voices want to go. But if you start at the end and work backwards, then you can see exactly where the voices in the previous chord want to progress to, and it makes life a lot easier deciding on where particular voices or notes are going to go. So if we begin at the end and work our way up, we should be hopefully okay. Okay, so there's no figured bass written at all under this F, so obviously that suggests a root position chord. So a third and a fifth above that F. A third above that F will give us A, and a fifth above that F will give us C. So I'm probably going to, put my C in the tenor line there, just to give a bit of space between the bass and the tenor. It's usual to have, as I say, quite a bit of space between those 2 voices, so I don't want them too close together just yet. And for the alto, I might put an F there, and I could put an A there. Yeah, well, that's not too bad. I may want to move those voices around. If I do, I could, for example, have an F there and the A there. That may lead us into some difficulty, I think, if we're going to have the F up here, because I can't really approach it in the soprano line from that C, because that's going to lead to hidden octaves, which is an absolute nightmare. Hidden octaves occur when the 2 outer voices progress or move the same direction, with the top voice moving a leap onto an octave or a fifth, and you can see that both the soprano and the bass parts are moving in the same direction. The soprano's leaping by a leap, and they both leap onto an octave, F and F. So I can't put C there, which isn't good, because I end up with hidden octaves. Now, if I was to change the C to an E, I still end up with octaves this time, but it's E in the bass and E in the soprano, moving to F in the bass and F in the soprano. So again, that may lead us into difficulty. So I can't put a C here, and I can't put an E here. And the only other note, I suppose, for this chord would be a G. So I would have to approach that F from quite a high note. So already my voices are getting quite spaced out. And I suppose I could harmonize this, for example, as a C, E, G chord. So I probably could do something like this in order to keep that tenor line nice and smooth, you know, C going to C. I end up with quite a large space between the soprano and the alto. It's not more than an octave, but it is an octave, so I may end up with some difficulties if I don't have those voices getting a little bit closer together in the previous chords. So you can see how determining your the last chord first can lead to different choices that come before it each time. So what I might do then is just move this to the F there and move that to the A there. Now that will actually help us get smoother voice leading here. There we go. So there's my FAC chord, and the chord before it is the first inversion chord. A third above that E is G. There it is. And a sixth above that E is C. And I've doubled the root of that chord, so it's two C's. C, C, E, G. The C's in the tenor and the soprano. So it leads to sort of a nice, smoother voice leading for that final cadence. The only thing I don't like about it is that we're ending on an A in the soprano line. It's always nice, if you can, to end on the tonic note in the highest voice in the soprano part. So it would have been nice if we could have ended on an F, but just for this example, we're not going to do that. Okay, so that's our first two chords. Now, the chord before that is actually at the start of this bar. Here we can see a C in the bass, and we've got this continuation line under that C, this line here. That means that whatever chord we decide to put above this bass note, or whatever notes we decide to put above this bass note, they should last until the very last beat of this bar, C, E, G chord. So that's why there isn't going to be any figured bass above that D. Okay, so the bass line is just moving as the chord above is being held. So a continuation line will always mean continue that chord as the bass moves. So there aren't any figures beneath that C. So again, it's a root position chord, another C, E, G chord. So we're looking for a third above the C, which is an E, and a fifth above the C, which is a G. And what I might do is try and keep the C in the tenor line. So we have a very nice static tenor line that doesn't move at all over those chords, which is really nice. And what I might do is put, say, the E here. So the E is going to the G, so it's not too far away. And actually I could put the fifth of the chord right there. Also be careful you don't end up with any overlapped or crossed parts. You know, for example, if I was to put, say, a G here in the tenor part, that's higher than the alto part. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to cross your parts or overlap your parts. And also the alto line here is progressing to a G. You also don't want that to overlap or cross with the previous voice part. So the previous voice had E, and the soprano has a G. So you wouldn't want this alto line to go higher than where the soprano was. For example, you wouldn't want this E note to leap up to C, like that. Okay, so you can't do that either. So you're actually singing, or alto line is singing a note which is higher than what the soprano line was singing before, so you can't do that either. So if I put that back, it's at the moment it hasn't crossed where the soprano line was, so it's just on the same note, so it's fine. You don't want to go any higher than that though. Okay, for this chord, with the B flat at the bass, again a third and a fifth above that B flat because it's a root position chord. So we are looking for a D, the third above the B flat, and an F, the fifth above the B flat. And we're probably going to double the root as well. And if we can't double the root, we'll double the fifth. Okay, so I'm thinking maybe if it's a B, D, F chord, maybe the D would be nice close to that E. Or maybe it would be nice, yeah, in the tenor line. Yeah, I might change that and put it in the tenor line. Yeah, I'll put it in the tenor line because it's right next door to the C. Yeah, so that's where my D is going to go, and I'll actually make my F go there. Yeah, so that's where my fifth is going to go of that chord on the alto line, because then that can just fall nicely to the E. I can't put my B there in the tenor line because then I end up with consecutive octaves between these notes. Okay, so that's your parallel octaves. We can't do that. And I wouldn't want to maybe do an F because it's a bit of a leap up, or this F, it's a bit of a leap down. So yeah, D's the better choice there for that voice. And F is a good choice for the alto. And what I can do then is just put double the tonic, double the root of the chord up there in the soprano part. Okay, so it's looking good so far. Okay, so we've come across our first 6/4 chord, our second inversion chord. So we're looking for a fourth above that C, which is an F, and a sixth above that C, which is an A. Okay, so, and we also want to double the fifth of the chord. Remember, for second inversions, doubling the fifth is usually pretty good, and you usually, not always, but you usually do that in the tenor and bass parts. So if I have two C's in the bass and in the tenor, they're both moving in opposite directions after that, so no risk of consecutive octaves there. So that's where my C's are going to go. Keeping the inner voices smooth, the F could probably go there in the alto line. So this is going to be an FAC chord, obviously. So we have, let's see, the A to do. So probably then the only place we can put it, of course, would be there in the soprano part. Okay, so that's progressing quite nicely. This chord before that, on D, we've got 6 in the figured bass, indicating a first inversion chord. So we're looking for the third, remember, and the sixth. So the third would be the F above that D, and the sixth above that D is a B flat. And in fact, that's probably where we could put the B flat right there. So we have this nice scalic stepwise movement in the tenor line, and even better after that, it doesn't move at all. So a really nice smooth tenor line. And also a smooth alto line as well, if we put the F right there. And of course, the best note to double in root position and first inversion chords is the root of the chord. So the B flat, this is a B, D, F chord. So B flat would be the best one to double. So there we go. I'm just keeping an eye out for consecutive fifths and octaves as I do this. Usually when you have two chords, especially in root position, that are right next door to each other, those are areas you've got to be very careful. Usually chord 4 to chord 5, or maybe an interrupted cadence like chord 5 to chord 6. Those are very common places for errors when it comes to parallel fifths and octaves. So check to see that your octave in the chord, your B flat, in your B flat, make sure they don't progress to the same note. One goes to C and the other goes down to G. So thankfully no consecutive octaves. And of course your fifth in this chord, B flat to F is your fifth. You don't want C to G, and we don't have it. We have C to E. So no consecutive fifths either. So those are the areas you've got to be really careful of when it comes to parallel fifths and octaves, or consecutive fifths and octaves. Okay, so we're looking for a 5-3 chord here, which is just a third above that C, which is an E, and a fifth above that C, which is a G. And we probably want to double the C, the root of the chord, because it is root position after all. So if we double that C, we could probably put the C in the tenor line so that it progresses to the B flat, nice and smooth motion there. And then we can put the E in the alto, and then the G in the soprano part. Okay, so now we've reached our 6-4 chord, and if you remember what I said before, for 6-4 chords that have 5-3 written after them, that indicates very specific movement in those parts. So the fourth above the C, which is actually going to be an F, and the sixth above the C is going to be an A. Those notes should progress to the fifth and third above the bass note. So the sixth above the C, our A, should be up here, because that sixth is falling to the fifth above the C. And the fourth above the C is an F, and that should be here, progressing or falling to the third above the C. And as I said before, for second inversion chords, double the fifth. So this might look like consecutive octaves, but it actually isn't when you're told or you're given very specific instructions. A second inversion chord to a root position chord, these types of cadential progressions, cadential 6-4 here, you have to sort of be very careful with the movement. And it kind of does just imply, the whole bar implies almost like a dominant chord 5, a C, E, G chord. And these two notes almost act like a suspension falling down. So yeah, it may look like consecutive octaves, but this is okay. Okay, so for this chord in the first bar, the very last chord of the first bar, it's another first inversion chord. So we're looking for a third and a sixth above this A. Okay, so a third above the A is the C, and the sixth above the A is the F. So the most obvious place then to put the F is the alto line. Whoops. There we go. Got there eventually. So the F stays where it is in each chord. That's good. Oh, actually, you could even do that for the C as well. So you could have a C. Yeah, I suppose. You could have a C in the tenor line, move into the C in the tenor line. So that's a nice static tenor line there. And we have our F, we have our A, we have our C. In order not to make it too static, that it doesn't move at all, I probably don't want to double the A for numerous reasons, because it's the third of the chord, which we shouldn't really double. And also we can double, if we were to double the root of the chord, the F would be way up here. That's a bit of a leap down to that A, and then it continues in the same direction going downwards. That's not great. So we probably don't want to double the root, and we can't really double the third, so we can't have an A. So maybe the C. Would be the best note to double in this chord. So the C is only falling down to A this time. So that's a good example of, maybe that's better in this instance to double the fifth rather than the root. I think everywhere we've had a root position and first inversion chord, so far we've doubled the root. So this is the exception. Doubling the fifth of the chord is actually going to produce better results here, or smoother voice leading. Okay, the chord before it, this looks like a passing 6/3 progression. We have a G in our bass, and we're looking for a third above it, which is B flat, and a sixth above it, which is E. So the E is going to leap down if it goes there. It's going to leap down if it goes there. It's probably the best place to put the E would be in the alto, because it's only moving by step up to F. And that leads us to another very important thing when it comes to doing these exercises, and that is the leading note. The leading note of your key is the 7th degree of the scale, and it's given that name because traditionally it wants to lead upwards. It likes moving up. So you can actually see most of the time, I think nearly all the time, we have an E, and we're moving to a completely new chord. That E is moving up to an F. E up to F. Here again, E moving up to F, leading note rising to the tonic note. And again over here at the cadence, E moving up to F. So keep an eye out for that as well. Traditionally it will happen on chord 5 and chord 7, like we have here. This is going to be a leading note chord. So yeah, an EGB. Yeah, an EGB chord. Okay, so we've got our leading note rising to the tonic. Probably then the B could either go here, but then if I put the B there, I end up with a sort of diminished fifth moving to a perfect fifth, and it isn't great. It hasn't got a great sound. Although it's not consecutive parallel perfect fifths or anything, it's because this is a diminished fifth and that's a perfect fifth. It still doesn't sound great. Diminished fifth should resolve inwards, or it should resolve a specific way. So I'm not going to put the B there. It's probably better putting it in the tenor line next to the C. So that means I'll need to change this. And probably the only note that I can put it to would be G. Okay, so this is our diminished chord, or chord 7, our EGB chord, and you notice that we've doubled the third. So having 2 Gs, that's quite common in diminished chords to double the third. So even though in one of the guidelines I say don't double the third, most of the time, yes, especially for your primary chords, 1, 4, and 5, you shouldn't have to, unless there's a very specific reason for it. But for diminished chords and interrupted cadences, going to chord 6, doubling the third of a chord is quite common. So I would almost say any diminished triad, you should probably consider doubling the third of the chord. And our very last chord, which is our first chord in this exercise, is another root position chord. So we're looking for a third above that F, which is A, and a fifth above that F, which is C. And we probably want to double the tonic if we can. So maybe doubling that root note in the alto part. So we have this F, E, F movement in the first bar. And do the same thing again for the tenor line, having a fifth. So maybe having the fifth in the tenor line would be good. So it's moving down to B flat in the next chord. So that's nice and smooth. And of course, the best place for the A would probably be the soprano line. Okay, so before we play it to hear what it sounds like, I don't think there are any parallel fifths or octaves. Yeah, I don't think so. And I don't think there are any cross parts or anything, no. And also looking at the movement, especially the inner voices, that's usually a dead giveaway if it's going to sound halfway decent or not. If the inner voices are nice and smooth, it should sound pretty good. So we have C, B flat, C, 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 B flat, C, D, C, C, C. That's a really nice tenor line. So it's nice and stepwise, no wild leaps or anything. And the alto part, the same. There's a skip there between E and G, but it's nothing, tremendously bad or anything. And the soprano line is actually a little bit more animated, a bit more lively and interesting, which is what you'd expect. So there's a little bit more leaping going on in the soprano line. Yeah, that's not bad. And the bass line you can't change. So whatever bass they've given you, you have to keep that. So let's hear the whole thing to get an idea what it sounds like. We'll start from the beginning. It's not bad. Okay. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how to do question 2. So just to sort of recap, question 2 for grade 6, you obviously need to know about figured bass. You need to know about your root position, first inversion and second inversion chords. Root positions are usually indicated with nothing in the figured bass. Sometimes they're written out if they want specific voice leading after a second inversion chord. First inversion chords, the 6/3 chords, are usually indicated as just a 6 in your figured bass. And second inversion chords are usually indicated in full as 6/4. And there's 2 of them in this exercise. The best note to double in a 6/4 chord is the 5th of the chord, which is the bass note. In these examples, you can see it's a C. Okay, so those C's should be doubled, and they both are. If it's a root position or first inversion chord, always try and double the root of the chord. Keep the inner voices smooth. I would go so far as to say that's probably the golden rule when it comes to doing this question. If your inner voices are nice and smooth, you probably are on the right track. Spacing is another one. Don't have too much between your alto and soprano and your alto and your tenor. Between your tenor and your bass, very, very common to have more than an octave. So here you see in our very first chord, F in the bass, middle C in the tenor. So there's an octave, a compound fifth between those two notes. So that is the norm. And actually more than an octave in the next chord as well. And the next chord. Okay, and a couple of times elsewhere, like here. There's more than an octave between the B flat and the D. So that is fine. It may look strange at first, but it actually is the norm. Don't cross or overlap your parts. Make sure every voice is in its own sort of space and has its own sort of territory that the other voices don't intrude too much on. If there are any accidentals, you must apply them to your figured bass as well, especially it may indicate a minor key that you're in. And last, of course, is make sure there are no perfect fifths or octaves between any of your voice parts. Okay, that's probably the hardest thing to check for. As you go through it, you should be checking for it because it means if you do need to change something, you know where the chord is going to go to because you've done the next chord first. So if you start from the end and work your way backwards, it's much easier to change voice parts around rather than doing it from the start and progressing your way through it. Because if you end up changing voices, you got to make sure that what you change it to is going to fit with what comes before as well as what comes after. So it's quite a bit harder, I think, to do it that way. Okay. So that's our first look at the exercises for question 2. And again, if you guys have any questions or you need help with any of this, do get in contact with me. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you, and see you next time.